Well, my name is Austin Williams, and a very warm welcome to everybody attending to this Bookshop Barney with Helen Pluckrose, discussing her latest book, this one, the Counterweight Handbook, Principles, Strategies for Surviving and Defeating Social Justice Ideology at Work, in Schools and Beyond. The title in itself is so long it's probably offensive to dyslexics out there. But Helen is a writer and critic who was part of the impressive Grievance Studies expose, and is now the host of a Substack called The Overflowings of a Liberal Brain. And I put information in the chat room if you take a look, linking to the Substack, linking to a donations page. If you want to make a donation to the Bookshop Barney to keep us ticking over, that would be very much appreciated. And obviously to the book itself as an Amazon link. And actually on Amazon, Helen's biography says that she's got a background in late medieval women's religious writing. And every one of those, from medieval history to women to religion to writing, is now seen as potentially problematic, under threat from equality, diversity, and inclusion police. So she's a very kind of useful bellwether in this debate. Her work for Counterpoint focuses on critical social justice ideology, colloquially known as wokeism, and its threat to liberal democratic freedoms. And just to be inclusive, and because I eat too much chocolate, tonight my pronouns will be her, she. Anyway, it's a terrific book, not only explaining the, there's a joke there, by the way. Anyway, terrific book, not only explaining the issues clearly, but it also provides a template of letters and handy arguments on how to tackle it. Helen says that she's allowed a little schadenfreude when she hears of social justice advocates being caught out. So she's not averse to little linguistic cultural appropriation herself. So if you ever faced any workplace threats, or you've been stuck in an argument with a critical social justice advocate, now you know what you should have said. This book gives you that ammunition to go back at them, I suppose. And the way it works is I've asked Helen to just present the ideas, the core ideas of the book in 5 minutes or so. Then I'll raise some questions that I have with the book for another 25 minutes or so after that, just to give Helen more time to flesh out the argument, and for any of you that haven't yet read it to kind of understand the ideas. And then it's out to you for comments and questions. And if you can use the obligatory raise hand function as and when, we'll take the questions at the end rather than during. But if you want to make any comments, please make yourself known. So first of all, if you want to unmute, I know you're all muted, and I give Helen a round of applause. Helen, it's over to you. Over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me on here. I mean, the Counterweight Handbook was it's born of a lot of resources that we developed very much on the fly from the spring of 2020, when the Black Lives Matter protests exploded. Companies, schools at universities all started really getting very serious about a certain approach to anti-racism, a certain approach to trans activism, and really authoritarian about it. And so I was getting literally hundreds of SOS messages a day saying, this has come up in my work now, I don't know what to do about it. Some of my colleagues who had a bigger profile were getting thousands of messages. And so my colleague, my co-founder, Kevin Lowe, set up a Discord server, and we poured everybody into that. And then Carrie Clark, my other co-founder, started dividing people into groups, gathering resources, finding out what the most common problems were. We started producing templates, taking on individual cases, and going back and forth with employers and HR people to try to push back on a personal level, because so many of the organisations that sprung up around them are looking to change things in law through lawsuits or by democratic processes, which is very important, and others are looking at reforming institutions from the top down, which is also very important. But there's also that level of personal engagement. What do you do in your own life, in your own workplace, in your own university, your children's school? Waiting for these changes to come and trickle down to you, it feels quite futile. So we were giving people tools to try and create a groundswell of knowledgeable and principled resistance from the ground up. And so we we gave people a guide so that they could have a look at the policies and programs that were coming into their workplace and kind of assess them on our traffic light system. Because sometimes people would see the words diversity, equity, and inclusion and go in far too strongly, imagining it to be a really entrenched problem when it was actually a little bit of box ticking, and they could have dealt with it by taking a more patient approach. Other people will be far too tentative or agreeable to it, and then realize that they've let something slip in. So we gave them these kinds of ways to evaluate what kind of a problem are you having, then what realistically are your capabilities of dealing with it. So that both depends on your job security, the extent of the problem, and your personality. This gets missed quite a lot because some people have skill sets which include verbal argumentation, are calm in this kind of crisis. Other people have different kinds of skills, or they are conflict averse and they find it very difficult to engage in a back and forth. So having to get a balance of that. And then the book goes through an explanation of the basic framework that runs through everything so that it makes more intuitive sense. Speaking points that you're likely to hear, that you might want to think through your own principles and values and how you would respond to them from a principled standpoint that you are legally allowed to have. You are allowed to have your own philosophical, religious beliefs, so you can present a challenge in that way. And then we have some data on the ways in which EDI initiatives have failed, and some templates that people can adapt for their own use. So it really is a very practical handbook for somebody who's going through this right now. The comment I've received a lot in Amazon reviews is this was great, but it would have been even better a couple of years ago, which was when it was meant to come out.
I am intrigued by you saying it should have been out 2 years ago rather than now. Is that a lockdown phenomenon or what?
I think at that time, the intensity of it really was striking people for the first time, and they really didn't know what they were doing. So we had the Counterweight website up, and it had those resources on there. But ideally, I would have liked to have got that book out earlier. I became unwell for over a year, so that was delayed. But the while woke is waning, we saw it rising. And when it was rising, there were a lot of people getting taken out by it. And that's going to continue happening. We can't say because we can see statistically that companies are putting less money into this, they're coming away from their pledges to it. It's appearing less in workplace communications. It's appearing less in mainstream media. We can see some optimistic cultural signs there, but for individuals who are still working within workplaces or universities where this is a dominant moral orthodoxy, then that doesn't matter at all. I'm still sort of doing this work. I have five different sets of people dealing with quite a significant problem in their workplace at the moment. So we shouldn't get complacent about that.
Okay, okay. So I didn't mean to be prurient about your health issues. Apologies for that. But look, as you've gone through it, you've outlined what you mean by critical social justice. Or maybe you could do a little bit more on what it actually means. But also, can you just give us a snapshot of your counterpoint or your counterweight to that argument about liberalism, which is a very strong line in your argument that you're very much a liberal with a
Yeah.
lowercase l, I suppose. But do you want to just explain what that means?
A philosophical liberal, yes. I believe that Arthur John Stuart Mill and the sort of primary English philosophers, and then also what went into the American Constitution, the belief that people should be able to believe, speak, live as they see fit, provided they harm nobody else, nor deny them the same freedoms, that everybody comes into this world with the same right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness or property, as in something, and that we prefer to try to sort things out via democratic reform rather than revolution, and positively encourage the marketplace of ideas. So this is a very individualistic We treat people as individuals, not as members of groups. Although if they're being discriminated against because they're a member of that group, this is not precluded by the demand that we treat people as individuals. And we see people as part of our shared humanity. So we try to find common ground. We don't accept the critical social justice idea that you have to have a certain lived experience to speak on a certain thing. So critical social justice, which was named as such by Robin DiAngelo and Özlem Sensoy, is a particular approach to social justice that draws on the critical tradition with a capital C that comes originally from Marxism, but more post-Marxian and then very much postmodern concepts where you look at what is happening in society, not so much for what is true, without using evidence and reason, but to try to see the systems of power and privilege that are running through everything, how knowledge has been socially constructed. So at the root of critical social justice and what has caused it to be called woke is the belief that there are these systems of power and privilege like white supremacy, patriarchy, imperialism, cis heteronormativity, which is the assumption that everybody is both heterosexual and identifies as their biological sex, ableism, all these other things they run through. We've all been socialized into them because we've been born into this society. We've accepted this as true knowledge because it's been created by the people who have the power to establish what is true and what isn't, which is straight, white, wealthy men. So this power operates in their interests, we absorb it uncritically, and then we perpetuate oppression by the way we think and speak. So for the critical social justice, it's very important that we all wake up to this. We might think of the red pill people on the other side who are convinced that there are very different systems of power and privilege running through, but it's that same concept. We can see the truth, you can't, you need to wake up to it. And with critical social justice, you have to use this particular critical methodology. You have to affirm your white supremacy, your toxic masculinity, your transphobia, and then you have to commit to dismantling, detoxifying, decolonizing, or whatever in these specific ways. And of course,
Okay.
this doesn't work, and it is unethical. Yes.
No, okay. Look. I mean, you've probably answered about 10 of my questions
Oh,
already in that little.
I'm not concise, I'm afraid.
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. You come from an academic background. I wouldn't expect any less. But there's a couple of things you did raise there. There's the harm principle of J.S. Mill. There's longevity of the concept of woke itself, and individuality or individualism, I suppose, of liberalism. So let me just quickly ask you first one in terms of J.S. Mill and the harm principle. Obviously, part of the whole shtick of EDI or CSJ is to suggest that people are doing other people harm, which is like it's not the concept that J.S. Mill wouldn't necessarily recognize. So how would you posit your harm? Not we're not being harmed compared to what they're arguing.
Well, I always phrase it as material harm. I think George Orwell put it as unambiguous harm or something like that. So something that really is causing you a loss of your freedom, a loss of your job, physical pain, damage to your property. We have to have a very, very high bar on what is considered harm, and it cannot include ideas that are considered subversive or that could be bad for society. This people are always trying to ban subversive ideas, whether that's the idea that God might not exist or that it's okay to be gay, coming from the right. And then there's all the things that we're not supposed to believe now about how racism works and gender. So this idea that somebody can be harmed by somebody else having a belief which counters their belief, we cannot consider this harm. So I think when it comes to speech, particularly, when it's an expression of an idea, there's very, very little. Only on two occasions have I thought that speech itself um, that merited being penalised. And one of those was Anjem Choudhury, who had been advocating with his Islamist group, directly causing a lot of young men to go off to ISIS and kill people, or kill people in this country. And another was Helen who was not allowed into this country because she taught how to exorcise demons and witches out of small children who may have been epileptic or just had some minor ailments, and children died wherever she went. So this is where we can see speech actually does directly result in harm, but for the most time, if it results in offence, hurt feelings, and I don't say that lightly because feelings do actually matter, then we do have a responsibility to try to deal with our own emotions on that level.
Okay, so have you got a great answer to the fire in a crowded theatre counter position on this?
Well, that's, I would say, a misrepresentation of what freedom of speech is about. It doesn't mean anything that you can do with your using words. So you can't break confidentiality rules if you're a nurse or a doctor, for example. You can't conspire to commit a crime. You can't commit treason, and you can't give somebody information which causes them to harm themselves. You can't direct a blind person off a cliff or something like this. This is not the expression. For the principle of free speech is to protect the free exchange of ideas, not any kind of speech whatsoever, including intimidation, harassment, and conspiracy to commit crime.
Very good, very good. That's another one ticked off on my armory of arguments that I can now memorize in court. Look, so so that's the harm principle conversation. The one about the longevity of this concept. You say that we've passed peak woke. And
Mm.
obviously, since Trump got in, there's been lots of articles talking about it, about Facebook, Pepsi, Amazon. These kind of companies have all rolled back on their social justice edicts. But then you say the good news is that due to its destructive nature, lack of limiting principle, and internal contradictions, it will ultimately collapse in on itself, even if we ourselves are unable to directly defeat it.
Mm.
That's one side, so it's like almost naturally going to decline. And then the other side, you say that the ideas are firmly embedded. So I just wondered, is it on its way out? Is it here to stay? Even if it disappears, is it still going to dominate the conversation?
I think it is likely to mutate. It did get it's got to the point where different factions are kind of at each other's throats. Gay men, for example, have kind of been evicted from the sort of intersectional framework because they have a tendency not to be very woke. Lesbians have become suspect because many prominent gender critical feminists are lesbians. Women have kind of been knocked off because we're not entirely sure what they are, and also there's that whole white women tears thing, which is now a big thing within the racial thing. So we've ended up very much with two branches of it, the authoritarian queer theory, trans activism, and race activism, and they don't go well together. So they've been butting heads as well, and we've got a bit of a chaotic mess. So is it declining? It was. It has been. People have been less affected by it. I think people have been less horrified of being called racist. They've felt more confident to push back. We're seeing this in various metrics. But this could always resurge, it could evolve, and my fear at the moment is that if we get authoritarian efforts coming from the Trump administration in particular, and from some of the illiberal right, a sort of overreach on the anti-woke thing, this is going to make liberals who don't think through principles very, very clearly, but just react to authoritarianism, swing back the other way. And that I fear is happening, because quite a lot of them are writing to me.
All right. Okay. Well, again, I'll come on to that in a moment. Let me just quickly ask you this final point, which you raised at the start, about your general liberal perspective on individuals rather than
Mm.
what we say, groups. Anyway, it really comes across in the book in some respects. There's lots of personal responses to critical social justice issues, all being with the intention of building solidarity. But for example, trade unions which I'm old enough to remember them. But those institutions that we thought of as representing workers' interests only get a very brief one mention, I think, in your book. And actually, we now recognize that many of the unions are actively reporting members who don't play the game. Paul Embry, who's done a Bookshop Barney with us before, is one of them. The TUC has got mandatory EDI awareness and training for staff, etc., etc. So do you think that trade unions are now part of the problem? Do you think this is an individual battle, or do you think that there's another conversation to be had about kind of social solidarity?
There are so many conversations to be had when it comes to trade unions. Yes, we found that with Counterweight, people could not rely on their trade unions to address that. We had quite a few defectors from trade unions who came and offered us their expertise, which was great. And there were a couple of trade unions sort of set up to actually deal with this. But yes, that system, I think, because I admit to I am on the left, so am very much in support of the concept of a trade union, assuming that it works correctly, which it hasn't been. So there has been a lack of protection there, causing people to need to organise in different ways, sort of with each other in more informal networks or via outside organisations.
So, in terms then of one of your examples, because again, a large portion of the book looks at, well, not a large portion, but a significant number of pages are given over to individual case studies in some respects. And you cite one, let me just give it to you, one example of Chloe, who was so successful, you say, of criticizing her office EDI policy that they co-opted her into the system. And you say, quotes, she is now fully involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in a company where she is able to keep her organization open to diverse viewpoints. Now, I understand the inclusion is never means diversity never really means diversity of viewpoint. So I get the strategy, but I can think of nothing worse myself, being made, an interest into a world I don't want to belong to in the first place. Do you know what I mean? Becoming a member of a club that would never have me as a member. So is that a success? Or is that just surviving?
Oh, absolutely. That was a success. Our CEO for a while, Harriet Tyrrell, she also took this approach, which was why she helped us to lead things. She was faced disciplinary action, got herself eventually on the DEI board, then worked this round to an acceptance of genuine diversity, which includes viewpoint diversity, not conformity, genuine inclusion, which means the inclusion of people with all kinds of views, not the exclusion of certain views, and moved this critical social justice, this critical DEI concept to a liberal one, which has always been about accepting the diversity of ideas and the inclusion of the expression of all of them. So yeah, that has that is, if you can do that, if you can't bear to do that, then I quite understand that. But if you are somebody who's particularly skilled with speaking, with argumentation, if you want to get yourself on your DEI board and move it out of the critical social justice realm back into, in this country, adherence to the Equalities Act and the sort of general principles of people like Martin Luther King, the universalist, individualist, anti-discrimination generally on a consistent level, then absolutely do that. That you'll help a lot of people.
All right, very good. You put me in my place. Second, let me give you a second example then. A slightly different one is on the same chapter, but you were looking at a scenario of an employer in a university forcing participation of EDI initiatives, mandatory training, and et cetera, et cetera. And your quote is, you say, you might request that your employer look out for any developing signs of alienation, awkwardness, and fear in the workplace, as well as trends of sickness or other absence correlating with the training. Even if they say no to that request for you to follow up, the seeds may be planted that the training might lead to negative outcomes. I kind of get what you're arguing, but it does sound a high risk strategy where you might be kind of dobbing in your fellow workers to your employer. Look at Fred over there. He's taking the day off because he doesn't want to come in for training. Sounds like a sacking offense to me. But again, success or just one in
Yes,
a
I
raging
mean,
office.
it's just making employers aware, because this is particularly for the employers who are box ticking. They want to have these things set up. They quite often don't know even what's in them. We had one client who was accused of right-wing conspiracy theories for accurately quoting Robin DiAngelo saying that all white people are racist. So they don't know what's in there. So if you say to them, your stress levels can go up, and now there is evidence in chapter 3 and more advanced and more recent evidence of increase of stress, of ill health, of alienation within groups that result from this. So yes, look out for signs that this is making people unwell. Not that people are skiving, but that this is causing a high level of stress, that people are no longer wanting to come to work. They're not talking among themselves as they did. There's not a harmonious atmosphere. There's more tension, because that is the first thing that an HR officer or an employer would notice. But if they haven't paid close attention to what they've just imposed on everyone, they might not make that connection.
No, you're right. I mean, when it's all first kind of kicked off a couple of years ago, I mean, I know it's a long time coming, but when it really kind of consolidated, we were in my university, we were getting emails left, right, and center telling us what books we had to read in order to, become attuned to the real message that we were all ignoring because we were heteronormative. But the other argument you say in the book is that when somebody did quote back Robin DiAngeli's, what she actually said in the book, first of all, they were told that they were wrong, and then secondly, they weren't replied to after a while. So it is the case that people don't actually know what on earth is being said in this discussion, but
Absolutely.
engaging with it, sometimes they disengage. Rather than when you're trying to kind of correct them. But I just wanted to get this idea about the anti-war, the your worries, I suppose, which you've hinted at already, the way that we fight back against critical social justice. You're very clear that there should be no witch hunts. You say no witch hunts by anti-war activists, and indeed you spend a lot of your book talking about politeness and courtesy when you're challenging wokeness and EDI imposition. So, with your liberal hat on, are you as worried about the potential dangers of the hostile response to CSJ as you are to work itself, the very thing
Yeah,
itself?
absolutely, I am. I think that we've been writing. I think the first piece that I wrote saying that a backlash was going to come. We were going to break down an understanding of that racism is is stupid and wrong, and we're going to reignite this it becoming normal to evaluate people by their race, that this is going to backfire spectacularly from around 2018 that we were writing about this. And this is I am worried about a backlash from the some of the, I mean, anti-woke is, I'm anti-woke. So this is a very broad category, but for some people who want to use things like authoritarian trans activism to overturn legislation that enables same-sex marriage in the US, for example, we've got very strong examples of a backlash coming there. There's a drop in acceptance of same-sex relationships. Then we're seeing an increase in overt expressions of racism. So we've got that coming, which is very clearly illiberal. But then we have people as well, I think, who just want to be a little bit illiberal. Let's just ban these ideas. Let's just ban these books. Because these woke ideas, they're so clearly illiberal that banning them can't be illiberal. But this, of course, is opening up such a realm of subjectivity, and we've already seen it going very badly wrong, and it doesn't stand the test of time. Policies we need to put in place is that all ideas may be expressed, that no ideas are going to be censored, that nobody is going to be penalised for anything consistently. Because if we start to there's a choice. We can, with critical social justice authoritarianism, we can act to ban the critical social justice ideas, or we can act to ban the authoritarianism, take steps with policies and institutions to remove authoritarian, the ability to be authoritarian and censorious. And those are the policies I've been developing. If we do that, it will stand the test of time, no matter who's in power next time, how society changes. Whereas if we normalize banning a certain set of ideas, then we're into dangerous territory.
All right. Well, how about this then? And it's a little bit of a cheap shot because I read this poll separately. It's a Mori poll which came out a year or so ago, Ipsos Mori poll, which said that while many people aren't strongly engaged in culture wars at all, overall it is those on the liberal slash left side of the argument who tend to be the most intolerant of people who disagree with them. Do you recognize that? I'm not saying it's you. I'm just saying, I'm just saying liberalism has actually got a bad rap, bad name.
Well, that's because they're defining liberalism as left-wing illiberalism. That's got nothing to do with the belief in life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and let leave people alone unless they're hurting you. So that's just a concept creep that I am trying to, with Project Liberal in the US to bring to work back, because we can't just lose that concept of liberal, because that's a whole philosophical tradition that's underlying liberal democracies. So we really need to bring that back. But yes, I would say when it comes to acceptance of other ideas, the left have certainly been more inclined to police ideas, and they're also it shows they're less likely to understand the right views on the right as they are, while conservatives have been more likely to understand what left-wing views are. So there's a definite problem, specific kind of problem there with the left. With the right, when the right gets illiberal, it tends not to problematize and twist things so much as to go right to an authoritarian, no, we're banning this, we're not having this, and taking a very sort of strongly illiberal stance. So I think in its way, I mean, left-wing extreme authoritarianism is going to make you lose your job. It's going to make you miserable. It's going to make you afraid to speak. It's going to be quite Orwellian. If you get the worst of what is being called the woke right, the illiberal right, in a position of institutional power, then we are actually within the realms of genuine fascism, because that's what that is, the really illiberal woke right, the groypers, the Christian nationalists. We're right in that territory there, so we don't want to give that an inch.
Okay, concept creep. I've been called worse.
Yeah.
Uh, but I agree with you. And it's a bit like the linguistic kind of turnaround where progressive is now very often some of the least progressive people around, I suppose. But in terms then of when you were talking about earlier about racism and far right, people are generally frustrated out there. As and in some ways, this is a very useful kind of fillip. This book is a useful fillip to that frustration. But when they're called far right, it's now resulting in a lot of people saying, if you think I'm far right for criticizing, I don't know, migrant crisis, then so be it. Call me a racist. And it's obviously a dangerous turn when
Mm.
people, non-racists, brush off that terrible, terrible label of being a racist. So it's understandable, but it's not healthy. So how do we retain the perspective, especially as you say, when the language is changing? So liberals don't mean liberal anymore, progressives mean reactionary. How do we kind of retain a sense of cogency in the arguments when you know all is up for grabs?
When language keeps moving so quickly around us, this is why I think I kind of wrote a bit of a guide for thinking through what your own principles are. Now I am liberal left, non-religious, so I have a lot of things to come from, but any of my readers could be from somewhere else on the political spectrum, have different religious views. Think through when an authoritarianism problem is coming at you, there's a tendency to just kind of say to somebody with D'Angelo, all white people are racist, like type ideas. Well, that's just racist. But this is all prepared for. They have this all theorized around. So think through what you're being asked to affirm that you don't actually believe, and what is it that how does this affect you? So, for example, if you are a Christian, you may find that this concept that you are unavoidably socialized into having all these horrible beliefs to conflict with the Abrahamic belief that God gave us free will. You can respond to this on that philosophical ground, and it gives you a very strong protection, and that is also within the US. Only religious ideas are protected. Here we have philosophical ideas worthy of respect. So you've got these ways to think through what your own principles are, set them out in the strongest way, and kind of hold on to them. This is the worry with people sliding all over the place. I tend to think of it as right having a constitution of yourself. And I wrote a piece yesterday on the conflict, and I'm going to write a piece in the next few days about conflicting meanings of far right and what to do about that.
No, it's very useful, the fact that you have an entire section where you go through a number of um, uh, examples, definitions, if you like, to kind of clarify where we sit on a lot of these issues. So that's even that's very useful. Look, just coming to my last question, which may be a throwaway one, I don't really know. So please, everyone out there, if you have questions to ask, don't just put them in the chat. Put your hand up, we can take you live. But my last question is on whether the genie's out of the bottle in some respects, whether liberalism is now being overtaken by populism. And I just wondered what you thought about that shift. I mean, I got a sneaky feeling what you think about it, but do you want to just explain the dangers or the benefits of either?
Yeah, and I'm very concerned. I am of course arguing for liberalism, and I think that the majority of people are, in that broadest sense, liberal. We have been raised in liberal democracies. We genuinely have a strong sense of liberalism as something that should be due to us, if not something that we should act on. So I don't think that we're going to become post-liberal, but there is the chance that we might. There is significant pushback to liberalism from various forms of illiberalism. A lot of people leaning towards squashing out one authoritarianism with another. A lot of people losing the concepts that are central to liberalism. And so I particularly see people saying things like, we need to ban men from wearing dresses, for example. And, well, no, you can't actually decide other people's dress codes because this isn't hurting anybody. Well, I'm going to criticize it then. Good, yes. And then they are surprised because they think if I'm saying you mustn't ban it, then I'm in favor of it. But if I'm saying don't ban it, criticize it if you want to, and I'll defend your right to. If someone tries to fire you, I'll be on your side. But people do not seem to have intuitively that line between being able to criticize things strongly and trying to prevent other people from doing them. So bringing that back is something that I'm working on quite hard. And we've got a good sort of liberal community, right, from on the right and on the left, at my Substack at the moment.
Good advert. Put it in. I'll put it in the chat room. Have no fear. Right. Look, I've got a couple of hands, so thank you very much for that. Other people, please feel free. I know there's a few people who've written comments in the chat room as if you think I'm going to read them out, which push may come to shove, and I will. But you can verbalize it yourself. Right. I'll take a few if that's all right, Helen. Just a couple of questions, and then you come back, and then we'll move on. Yeah. So we have Kerry Dingle.
Unmute. Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, thank you very much for that, Helen. That was very eloquent. Just a couple of questions, if that's okay. Firstly, I do find that your idea of manoeuvring onto a DEI board or similar, something I feel very squeamish about, and feel that it's compromising too much. And why really do we need to do that? And what's wrong with the shot across the bows approach? It doesn't necessarily mean you're calling for bans, but you are, challenging what's being said with no holds barred, which is definitely my approach. On that note, I really would like to know a bit more about your view of Trump and populism, which you've already suggested there's some overreach going on there, where people like me, for whom I'm closer to Marxism than what seems to me wokery, which is closer to scientism. Nonetheless, people like me find the Trump phenomena very exciting. And it's surely that shot across the bow by the populist surge that is, in fact, putting paid to more wokery than ever before. And two quick other things. Is it a generational problem? I can see it's still embedded in institutions, although waning, as you say, but isn't there a generational problem? I deal with a lot of young people for whom this is part of their DNA. And lastly, does your liberalism not encourage a collective response?
Wow. Right. Okay. Hold fire, Helen. Even though I know that there were 3 questions sneakily put forward in that contribution, I'll take.
Oh, I've got 6.
Yeah, well, yeah, there was subsets. Let me ask one more person to speak. If I ask Stuart to cough up, and then we'll come back to you, Helen. Stuart.
Hiya, so
Ah,
it's Sue and Sue of Sue and Stew. My question is, Helen, I don't know if you've been following what's been going on in Fife NHS Trust this week with the nurse who felt embarrassed about getting changed into her uniform and other things in front of a man, a trans woman. And I was thinking, what would I have done differently, or would if you were to go way back to whenever those incidents happened, what would you advise her, or what would you advise us to do differently? Because she's now in court, and I've been following the court proceedings this week.
thank you very much. All right, Helen, do you want to give it a bash? See how you get on, and I'll come back to the other 2 in a moment.
Okay, well, I wanted to pick up Kerry's idea, but are we capitulating to DEI if we get on boards? And I would say no. This is the idea of getting onto a DEI board is not to perpetuate these identity politics ideas of power and privilege, but to actually disband them for a genuine inclusion of diverse viewpoints. So this is a resistance, not a capitulation. And then when you say, but what's wrong with a shot again across the bows, not banning, but we can certainly criticize it and say very strongly what's wrong. That's the kind of shot across the bows that I'm talking about. There's nothing wrong. That's exactly what we should do. And yes, we should do it in an organized way. And this is why I'm connected to various organizations, which is what I would answer to the lady who spoke secondly. What would I do in the case of this this nurse who felt uncomfortable and intimidated in the presence of somebody who was male, having to be undressed in front of him, who wanted to raise this issue but felt quite tentative about it, but was afraid from the bits I saw that she was being offensive. She didn't have a very she was trying to address it, but really seemed very conflict averse as a person. And what I would do with her is recommend her to talk to gender critical feminists, because there are a lot of liberal gender critical feminists out there who can help her to present her views as a protected philosophical belief. And I can certainly help with the letters asking for single sex changing facilities, why this is necessary, trying to change the institution like that. We've had some good sort of compromise things come out of that, where women have had their own spaces again. But sometimes in areas like education or in gender critical views, I will help people deal with them back and forth. But there are other organizations that I am connected to who are specifically providing resources for that. So we delegate, we swap things about.
All right.
Have
Oh,
I
go
missed
on. Sorry,
that's
go on. Yeah.
important? I see some other things here. Which should I pick up
No,
on?
no, no, no. I was only going to come back on what Kerry had asked you, because obviously, in one respect, it's kind of interesting that a Marxist was actually shouting the odds for Trump. But Kerry was suggesting that in some ways, Trump in the last 4 weeks or whatever it has been has probably done more to knock back a lot of EDI or DEI, however you want to say it, conversations than 5 years of liberalism, not in the correct sense as you might use it, but do you know what I mean? There has
I
been
think that remains to be seen. I mean, my concern with some of the executive orders in which they're going to be looking into investigations as to who might be a diversity hire and attempts to hide diversity hires, and there's going to be a lot of subjective thing there, which is going to target individuals who are then going to feel that they have to prove that they got their job legitimately. So I think there are good ways, and Jesse Single wrote a good piece about this. There are good ways to go about looking at, frankly, illegal processes that have happened. And then there are things which resemble witch hunts, where you're going in and you're making a lot of, particularly, we had a lot of Black Brits, particularly, who they were at 1 month 40% of people objecting to anti-racist training in the UK were Black, despite only being 4% of the population. So a big problem that is being reported by Black Brits is a feeling of being condescended to, of being treated as a diversity hire, of being assumed to be a diversity hire. So we've got a strong resistance coming from there as well. And I think this is where I think ethical conservatives, people who are in support of this, of Trump, need to ensure that there isn't an overreach, that there is a shutting down of anything that is authoritarian, that anything is illegal. But if it starts reaching into a lot of the rhetoric we're seeing online, where somebody is just assumed to be a diversity hire because they are Black, then we really need the ethical conservatives to say, no, that's not it. That's not what we're doing here.
Okay. I could come back, but it's not my place to do that. Let me see if Kerry can come back if she wishes, just to kind of add to the conversation. She did ask about collective approaches and generational issues, but we can come to that later. Piers and then Patrick.
Thanks very much. Great to see you, Helen, and I think your work's fantastic, and I enjoyed your cynical theories and many of the articles you've written. And I just really want to, I think, steelman some of the arguments that might be used by, if you like, the more sensible of the woke and CJB people, because you often talk about the liberal ideal, the classical liberal ideal of judging people on their merits and of diversity of opinion. And there's been a lot about that over the last few years. I dare say that the more sort of measured CSJ types would regard themselves actually as classically liberal in spirit. They'd say the best way to get diverse opinions represented is by listening particularly at allegedly or in reality underrepresented or historically oppressed groups, and that the best way to get the speech heard of such people is, or could be in some cases, by suppressing the speech or curbing the speech that has the effect not only of offending people, which is actually not the issue, but of invalidating the testimony of allegedly oppressed people. I mean, this obviously can go into overdrive, but I was reading quite a lot of philosophical literature over the last few years over the summer on the whole free speech issue, and some of it does come from this sort of perspective. But the argument actually stems from an argument that was popularized by Catherine McKinnon in the 90s about pornography. The reason why she objects to pornography was that it silenced women by invalidating their testimony, and hence she regarded it as a kind of hate speech. That one of the effects of hate speech is actually to invalidate the testimony of people who may have a formal permission to speak, but are never taken seriously when they do. And the point of free speech is not just to have a formal permission to speak, it's to be taken seriously when you do speak. Now, I think this idea has obviously got into overdrive with a lot of wokery. So I'm with you on a lot of what you say. But I think that's the steel-manned version of the CJG argument. It's not actually postmodernist. I mean, some of it is, obviously. It doesn't have to be. It's just an extension of a classical liberal ideal.
Okay, well, hang on a second, Helen. Well, look, all right, come back on Piers, since she's thrown the gauntlet down very dramatically.
Yeah. I certainly don't think that it is a classical liberal idea to say that some people need to be silenced in order for other voices to be heard. There is no right in liberalism to be taken seriously if your ideas do not have a right to be validated, and they cannot be invalidated by somebody else disagreeing with them. Now, what we can do is, if there is a situation in which some people are really not being heard, and I've used the example in the Counterweight Handbook, which includes conservatives in universities, is to ensure that people are included. There are ways to go about ensuring that you get a diversity of voices in there. Of course, if you try to speak to a group that is defined by an immutable characteristic like their race or their sex, and you try to get their testimony on things, what you'll find is that they differ profoundly and they disagree with each other. So there is no, I refute the idea, which comes from critical race theory, which is very strongly rooted in politics, linked to postmodern theory, that there is a unique voice of colour. There quite clearly isn't. So we need to ensure that if anybody is feeling unable to speak, that we have a genuinely inclusive environment in which they don't feel that way. But then we have to let the ideas battle each other, because liberalism isn't actually all that kind. It can be, Jonathan Rauch's Kindly Inquisitors is so good on this, where he says it's actually quite brutal. We're putting ideas up against each other. Nobody gets a final say. Nobody gets to say that their ideas are valid because of who they are or their authority. They just have to do battle, and people have to deal with the feelings that that produces. And I know that that does sound very harsh, but that is ultimately what it comes down to, because the alternative is always giving the dominant moral orthodoxy the right to say whose feelings need to be respected.
Very good. The right to free speech versus the right to have to listen to it, or in some ways to agree with it. I confirm with that. But Piers, do you want to quickly come back on any of that?
Well, I mean, I think I agree with what you say, Ray. The actual what's actually happening with wokery, and I work in universities, and not in my present job, but I have seen this sort of thing firsthand. So of course, it can be done in a very crude way. All I was trying to say really is that the point of trying to amplify the voices of the marginalized is to make their formal right to speak meaningful. Now, of course, there are a lot of background assumptions in that, e.g. that they haven't got a right to speak already, or that black people or so on speak monolithically. Obviously, they don't. And that's a problem that you've really genuinely put your finger on, in which, I'd agree with that. I'm just trying to say that really sort of some of the motivation for wanting to amplify the voice of the underprivileged, whoever they may be, need not be rooted in this sort of authoritarian postmodernism at all, but can be an albeit often misguided application of a liberal ideal, in many cases anyway, though the application, as you say, is often extremely crude, and that's where we get the problems that we've got.
I think the liberal aspect there is when we are making sure you're including various people. When it stops being liberal is when, in order to include, you need to exclude.
All right, good. We'll leave that one there for a moment. Patrick, and then Rush.
Yeah, thank you a lot. I mean, I think I agree with everything you said. Also, the way you came back to Piers, and I'm also been looking for a way of rebutting and battling the DEI overreach without becoming too aggressive, without getting and I see that reverse danger, some kind of right-wing, or let's say authoritarian anti-woke backlash becoming going too far and becoming making attitudes supposedly tenable. I mean, that's the kind of unfortunate reverse kind of swing. And I think we need to watch out for this, and I agree with you. So it's similar to what Piers wanted to say, although I agree with you that a lot of these ideologies are anti-liberal, but a lot of people maybe don't discern that to the same extent. And I think the difficulty for me is when you in a company environment, which I also want to mention briefly, where we actually started a sort of DEI process relatively late in that waning phase, and also kind of went in there, and you can't just kind of shut it down, but use it to develop the culture and be inclusive and hear individual voices, and there shouldn't be attached to categories like ethnic and race. And there, I think the identity politics gets in the way on this current kind of atmosphere, gets in the way that when you critique an idea, that this is seen as being ad hominem quite quickly, or that we have to be able to separate the idea from the person projecting it, and be emancipating from some kind of dysfunctional or unhelpful idea. Yeah, how do you praise what Trump is doing? Where to draw that line? For instance, Reform, or KB Badenoch, Rupert Lowe, some people like this. Where would you, are they going too far against the DEI, or are they part of a clearing the deck process?
Thanks very much, Patrick. Hold fire to that, Helen. It's kind of a way. I mean, let's go for the last comment, I suppose, towards the end, about where you stand in terms of reforms, populism, et cetera, and Trump. We'll come back to that one. Rush, do you want to come in?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Helen. Thank you very much for the introduction. As others have said, I've been a big fan of your work for a while, and I'm really glad this is coming out now. And I think there will probably be, it'll probably be quite timely given the fact that there may be some sort of a backlash to the anti-CSJ stuff in the US, in the UK in particular. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of currency for it. I wanted to ask you about this idea about to do with the paradox of tolerance. So we can probably accept that critical social justice is intolerant, and those that enforce it are intolerant, especially in the way that they've tried to get people fired, tried to get people to be persona non grata within society as a whole. And one could also argue that the kind of long march through the institutions that DEI and CSJ associated ideas has made and then has come to the fore more recently has been permitted through liberal tolerance. That's my position anyway, or one of the things that I'm considering. So in light of the fact that liberal tolerance has allowed this to perpetuate, why shouldn't there be a more muscular approach than the simple kind of marketplace of ideas, the use of free speech, being accepting, being tolerant of everything, and then just sort of calmly countering things? For example, I mean, more muscular, I'm not saying it should be violent in the way that Antifa and radical leftists often do, nor some on the right do. More, for example, naming and shaming some organizations that, for example, spread CSJ within schools without accountability, under the guise of protecting their materials through copyright, or potentially agitating for reform of the Equality Act, which one could argue has been the source and cover for many CSJ ideas, potentially. So why not be more muscular?
Very good. Thank you very much, Fish. Okay, Helen, do you want to pick up anything from those two?
Yeah, if you would remind me of the Patrick's last comment, but I'll respond to Rush, and I think that what we're talking about here, the liberalism that I am trying to defend here is not tolerant of intolerance. I think that what we are seeing when we have seen ideas come in the guise of being about social justice, not about liberalism, not about individual freedom and leaving other people alone, but it's social justice, and people have leaned into these because they accept general anti-discrimination. Well, you know, we treat people as individuals regardless. This has crept in, but this is where there has been a failure of liberalism, because as soon as something becomes in that's liberalism's one job. It only has one "you must not," and that "you must not" is impose your stuff on other people. So as soon as that happens, this is where liberalism is supposed to come down quickly and say no. That is what has not happened. And we get this generally quite well in relation to religion. We understand that to respect religious freedom, we do not, we tolerate people having different religions. As soon as one of those religions starts to say, well, you must not criticize my faith, you must not desecrate my book, you must not insult my prophet, you must not blaspheme, you must not do this, a liberal society needs to say, yes, we can do all of those things, and if you try to prevent anyone from doing those things, you will be arrested. So I think that's pretty muscular. It's just not been happening.
Very good, very good. I think Patrick gave you a lot of flattery along the way, Helen, but its final remarks were really kind of trying to look at the contemporary moment of, as we've said before, Trump's election, the emergence of reform.
How do we decide when people are going too far and when they're not? And I think this is where we have to be careful of trying that. There's a real need at the moment to kind of want to get behind a certain group and say, yes, this person has got it all right, this party has got it all right. Well, they're not going to. So what we have to do is have a look at somebody like Kemi Badenoch. I would say she's the most impressive liberal conservative that her going at the moment. I'm very glad that she's leader of the opposition. I'd like her politics to be left wing, but if we can't have her, I'm glad the Conservatives have got her. So I don't see her as going too far. I don't see her as having strayed into a liberalism at all. And if anybody can suggest an example to me, then I will consider it, because I may have missed it. But when it comes to what various politicians, policymakers and people are doing, I think we have to look at things case by case. And this is where we need particularly Conservatives, particularly Trump voters, those who have been saying to me now, it's going to be very important not to become what we hate. We need to keep to our constitutional principles. We need to have that strong sense of conservatism that's rooted in the founding of our country. We need those people to be watching very carefully what is happening on the right for incidents of overreach, and then pointing them out every time, just as people on the left, as I have been doing for the last 10 years, is bringing up cases and looking at them each time, getting a conversation going around about them, so that we have to be granular on this. We cannot say, well, Trump is an authoritarian or Trump is actually a liberal, because sometimes he may do things that stray into authoritarianism, and then his party will need to say, hang on, no, this is not constitutional. Other times he will do things that are absolutely great, and people should then give him credit for that. So we must try to be both charitable and discerning.
I think rule by executive order is one of those things you might have in your mind when talking about slightly less democratic processes of Trump, even though the outcomes might be what we'd like to see, but maybe the process is not
The outcomes
ideal.
could be liberal or illiberal. That's the
Yeah.
thing. Is it
Yeah.
letting people believe, speak, live as they see fit, or is it is it denying their freedoms? That's what we have to look at.
Indeed. Okay. Kerry, do you want to come back?
Yes, please. Thank you very much. Great stuff, Helen. And I will get your book now. You've sold it to me, but I do have a problem in that you make this all sound like it's about civil behavior. It's about how we argue. It's about the process and codes of conduct. A very sort of, you know, the obverse, but the same thing as Me Too, don't touch my knee. You know, where you seem to be saying, careful now, which is exactly what the working class in general and the masses who've mandated Trump and voted for him are being accused of. And so I'm more excited about a working class populist response in America and elsewhere than I am about careful now, you know, watch out, be careful how you speak, maneuver onto that DEI board. Why should we do that? Surely what Trump does represent is a collective response. You might not like everything he says, I don't. And there might be things we want to challenge, but it is a collective response, and it is what seems to be driving social change. And surely what we want is social change, not just good manners.
Well, I'm certainly not arguing for good manners. I'm arguing for strong arguments. But you are right that I am not a policymaker. I am not suggesting how we should change the law. I have set out policies for institutions and things. What I specifically address is principles, the way people are what their principles are, what their goals are, how they are addressing them. So I could stop doing that and go into policy, but I think I'm of more use supporting policymakers with by addressing cultural issues. So it really isn't an either or. I think that we need to have legal changes. You can certainly be more excited about the government, the state the things that are being done by the state. But you can also, if you are interested, and if you're not, then you don't have to. Of course, if you are interested in getting involved in the discussions of the issues that are going on at the moment, in talking about how to think about things, what the principles are of things. One thing that I'm finding quite annoying with a subset of the populist movement at the moment is that my colleague Carrie Clark keeps writing very, very good breakdowns of problems with policies in the NHS that have presented the idea that male lactation, for example, has been tested and shown to be safe, that is proposing a puberty blocker trial, which is actually going to just undo the puberty blocker ban in ways that people don't realise. She is breaking all of this down and saying why these are unethical. And then she's getting a response from the populist branch of the gender criticals saying, we don't need you academics telling us that the science says this is wrong. We know it is. We feel it is. Well, just you're an elitist getting in the way. Their action, when she's actually supporting their position that this shouldn't be allowed to happen, with information that parents can use to inform their decisions if they're being told that their child might commit suicide, for example, that they can use to write to their MP, that they can use to bring to their NHS trust, that they can use to create change on a policy level. And so I think that is sometimes where we have a problem with a populist approach, where it is contrary to backing up its ethical aims with supporting evidence, when it's actually hostile to evidence, even when it supports it. So that's the only place I would have a problem with a recurring problem I see in populism. Otherwise, if people are addressing things collectively, and I am addressing things collectively but then I think this is a very positive thing to do, and I don't think there's a right way to do it, and I don't think you have to focus on a certain level.
I think that's a reasonable response. I think. I mean, obviously there is that general conversation about having a broader approach to political ambitions and the detail of how maybe you'd go about a certain aspect of that political approach. In the same way as obviously you have on one hand Trump, who's with his executive orders, who actually is doing policy and is doing some of the detail. You might not think it's detailed enough, but the flip side of that is the Reform is a policy light organization because maybe they don't really feel as if they have to come up with anything yet.
But there's also, I mean, it isn't, the Reform doesn't only come from here. I mean, at the moment, three of the organisations that I am helping to sort out their policies, one of them has 600 employees, one of them has 2,000, one of them has 500. So these policies, and the 500 are children. So these policies that we're working on, which are about setting things out in words, in principle, setting out defences of freedom of belief and speech, and proscribing authoritarian ideological control, is actually benefiting very many people, working class people, children, who are having this imposed on them. So it isn't an either or if you're dealing with things on a social level, an institutional level, or a legal level.
No, somebody has to do the groundwork. Yeah, I completely endorse that. Patrick, do you want to come back in? Your signal was a little bit dodgy last time, but you want to?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Sorry about this. No, I mean, I just wanted to ask. My feeling was, let's say, it was surprised when we had the anti-woke free speech advocates starting to smear and wanting to shut down the, let's say, pro-Palestinian campus movements and used, call them anti-Semitic. I thought that was a kind of strange irony when you can see that it's so easy to flip, to make the similar mistake one has been even for years been, saying, don't use these racism and anti-Semitic smears, let's, and that I do see that. I wonder how you feel about it. And that doesn't mean that one shouldn't be kind of, quite inverted commas, frank, ruthless in one's criticism of other views, but these kind of conversation and discourse stoppers need to be avoided.
They do, and I think they need to be avoided by everyday people becoming more aware of when this is happening, feeling more confident to push back at it, and this is where I am coming from. It is a very ground level individual thing, is that I am trying to get more people in whatever situation they are to feel confident to say, no, hang on, this is not right. We should not be doing this. We need to address, we cannot impose these views on other people. And so trying to to get people having those conversations, it's very important to changing culture, because this idea that politics and culture are somehow different things, so that we quite often hear, really fails to realize that politics is a product of culture. We as a culture start to worry about certain things, we want certain things, then politicians are going to form platforms in order to give us those things, and then they're going to have policies based on those things. So the feedback loop there, we really do need people addressing issues of policy, but we also need people addressing issues of culture, because if somebody tries to impose a policy that doesn't resonate with what the cultural concerns are, it's just not going to work.
Thanks so much, Helen. Daniel.
Yeah, thanks, Austin. I wasn't going to say anything, but this the Israel-Palestine thing came up, and I don't want to talk about the substance of that, but it does relate to the free speech discussion and the liberalism discussion, because I think Patrick was a bit one-sided in the way that he posed it, because I'm very much on the pro-Israel side in the discussion, but I would concede that there are people on my side who try to clamp down on the speech of the anti-Israel people. And I think the anti-Israel people, as long as they're confined to speech, we're not talking about violence, and there are genuine instances of violence, but in relation to speech, they should be allowed to say what they want. But I would also say, and this is what I think Patrick missed out, there is the BDS campaign, Boycott, Disinvestment and Sanctions campaign, which is all about trying to clamp down freedom of expression and freedom of speech on the pro-Israel side, and also very much moves into anti-Semitism. So I would say that if you wanted a kind of case study of what you might call mutually assured cancellation, both sides trying to cancel each other out, not that the substance of both cases is equal, because I don't think it is, but I do think you have both sides trying to cancel each other out, and it really just creates a huge amount of confusion and is really problematic. Whereas I would say we do very much need free speech and open debate, but of course when it comes down to violence, that's a completely different matter.
Indeed, and I think that is an important a point to make. And when we have pro-Israel people supporting the right of pro-Palestine people to say even anti-Semitic things, then we have a defense of free speech. We have then a solid basis to work on. We're not seeing the favour returned very much, and we can draw attention to that. And there has been so many layers of things going on around Jews in particular at the moment, which I think has caused some people to have concerns for the first time about the woke left, particularly when there was apologism that I think it was driving nails into somebody's vagina is different to rape, and coming from alleged progressives. Then there was a big disillusionment with the woke left at that point. But then we are seeing such a rise of anti-Semitism on the woke right. I am apparently believed by large segments of it to be funded by Israel and Jews in order to make everybody multiracial and trans people or something. So we've got this insanity coming from the writers as well, and it's both, and both of these are very much targeting Jews who are very, very vulnerable at the moment. And so we're seeing a lot of pushback from the liberal anti-woke out of concern for that too. So I think we're going to see a lot of flashpoints, and things are really messy at the moment. So anybody sort of hoping for a simple formula to navigate their way through this is probably not going to be in luck.
We won't end on that note, but so there's a note in the chat room which I suppose I have to read out, but it follows on from that, I suppose. It says, given the dominance of woke ideology across institutions, is it possible to engage in free speech with those who don't believe in it? And I know that your book is kind of very much saying there are some people that just are not going to change, and this is very much targeted to slightly more flexible people's attitudes. So do you want to just, is it feasible to engage with this? And I know the book actually answers that question, but if you want to just
Well, it does, because it's got its traffic light system in there. Now, is it possible, are the way institutions set up just going to clamp down on freedom of speech, and all the will in the world is not going to change it? Yes, some of them are. Elizabeth Spivak, the professor of psychology who got cancelled herself and was part of the Counterweight team, has been addressing the layers and layers of administration that are in universities at the moment, and that we can't just say, well, we're going to change culture now and everything will be fine. It's going to have to be gradually unpicked. So that's going to be very difficult. In other situations, then we are seeing a relaxing of the former quite authoritarian approach, and people are starting to make headways, and some organizations have managed to sort of protect freedom of belief and speech from the start. So I would say that in every situation, you go in and have a look. If you're in a code red, where your institution is just captured, there is very little that you can do with polite communication, and that is when we are talking about the various organisations that you can go to, like the Free Speech Union, various other specific organisations that will defend you on a legal level. But if you're on a code amber, where there is still the chance of reforming things from the inside, they have strategies that you can do for going at that. So it's a kind of understanding that things vary very much, and then responding to what you're actually faced with is I think the first vital step.
Yeah, it's also the case, I suppose, that, like in my university, were I to have joined a university that was very overtly doing this in the first place, I would have less of a leg to stand on if I joined it than if I was in it when it was during a code green, moving upwards the chain towards more capture. So, in some ways you have your own cross to bear in some respects if you buy into it in the first place. But my question here is, just very quickly, because you've mentioned Robin DiAngelo, and she's this kind of central figure with her book, and it's been quoted left, right, and center. A white woman who's ridden the wave of critical social justice, and a lot of activists defending or arguing in favor of this kind of racial justice or social justice tend to be kind of white middle class people, just to parody it. But how has she got away with it for so long? I mean, is it possible that she will be turned on by her own supporters, but how has she managed it?
Well, I mean, she has been falling from grace. I mean, she's some of her ideas, among more, well, still, I would say the critical social justice left have turned on her as a white woman for dominating this scene, making it all about white women's feelings, and how white people are approaching everything. So there has been an internal attack on her, but I think she caught on to a zeitgeist of kind of white guilt at the time, and there was a market there for white, including liberals who wanted to continue opposing racism, which does still exist, obviously. So I think she caught on to that. And because it's so simplistic, her thing, it's very much is you accept that you believe these things, and then you examine everything you do, and you try to dismantle it from yourself. It's quite a narcissistic, introspective thing. It doesn't actually do anything to help anybody. And so it can be quite appealing, I think, in almost a spiritual way. I'm not going to make a trite, well, this is a religion thing, but this idea that you can work on yourself, that you can change society by doing this internal work, I think has been appealing to a particular subset of, yes, as you say, mostly white, mostly middle class, left-leaning women.
Good. And just my final question is, in your glossary of terms, which we've already mentioned, you have one entry which is on blackness, and we often speak about Englishness, or in my case Welshness, when we speak about cultures or characteristics. So you can briefly explain what you mean by that, but I wanted to just slightly go left field and just ask you what you thought about Muslimness. And especially in the light of Angela Rayner's kind of Islamophobia definition. Do you want to make that into a decent question and answer it yourself in your own way?
I'm not quite sure what you're referring to there. I mean, when it comes to accusations of Islamophobia, we obviously need to divide those into criticism of Islam and people who hold the beliefs of Islam, which is absolutely legitimate, and prejudice against people who have Muslim names and may have a variety of beliefs. So anti-Muslim bigotry can be a thing, which is when it hits someone indiscriminately of what they actually believe and do, whereas criticism of Islam is a different thing. So Muslimness, I think that could fit into anti-Muslim bigotry because it could be an atheist who has a surname Ahmed. You know, if you've got this this prejudice against a cultural group, and in this sense, blackness is a cultural group in an American context because it's a culture that grew up with its own developments in that context. I'm not sure if I answered what you were asking there, but
No,
lots
it was
of things suggested themselves to me.
it was an incredibly ham-fisted question, but it was a good answer, so that's fine. Look, I've got John and Therese. I don't know which one. Both.
Me.
Hi.
The perceived trends suggesting a waning of woke may well be true, but there also was a recent survey of several thousand people in the Gen Z age group, so roughly 13 to 28, that suggested a majority favored dictatorship for this country.
Yes.
So ought we perhaps to be preparing for, bracing for a potential backlash when a generation who've had woke ideas firmly inculcated as part of their schooling, you know, formally and informally, emerge into positions of power?
Yes.
And I don't know what form of dictatorship they would like. I didn't sort of drill down into it, but the way things are, the potential for dictatorships with all the different ideologies that are floating around, whatever form of dictatorship it is, whether it's woke dictatorship or any other, it's quite concerning.
It really is very, very concerning, and that's something that I keep saying to people, and I write in the book. If we believe our own claims that young people have been indoctrinated in universities and not provided with any other ideas, we have to accept that there are people now up to 30 who really cannot distinguish their own beliefs from just being a good person, who cannot distinguish authoritarianism from just being inclusive of people. And there really is going to need to be something in place to catch these young people who have come from this kind of situation. We're talking specifically about the woke here, of course, and I developed the idea of cultural competence, where we can try and perhaps make up for the lack of variety of ideas, where we can try to perhaps explain how liberal democracies work and try to fill in gaps in those educations, because this is what employers would rather do a lot of the time. A lot of people, so this may seem like a digression, but a lot of people seem to want us to fire everybody who has woke ideas, but a lot of employers will say to me, I have these young people and they're lovely generally, but they have these ideas and they don't recognize that this is a political idea. What do I do? If we're going to have an ethical way of trying to address this problem, we may need to send people for a kind of training, which is not going to be you must affirm this, but you must accept that these other ideas exist and are allowed to exist. So there are, and that's a very brief summary of how I think we need to catch those young people. But as you pointed out as well, Teresa, it's not only the woke. We are seeing a surge towards some quite liberal right ideas, particularly from young men. It's only a subset of young men. It varies interestingly by demographic, but a worrying number of young men think that Andrew Tate, for example, has some good ideas. So I think this radicalism, this lack of appreciation for democratic processes and liberalism is something that we absolutely do need to prepare for. And you're right, we should not think that these figures showing the waning of woke means that everything's going to disappear when we've got young people who've had this education.
Thanks very much indeed. Patrick, short and sharp, final points.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, would you go as far as saying what I would probably, that as an atheist, we can own up to Islamophobia, and religion and religious belief is not an immutable characteristic, And I think this conflation of this with racism is so hugely problematic. We need to
Yes.
be able to ruthlessly, criticize cultures, ideas, patterns, and they might be connected to. So that racism notion actually hardly exists at all anymore. Where
Yes,
you
Come back on that if you would.
yeah, I just said, yeah, that when it comes to, we do have to separate out racist prejudice against all brown people, for example, from genuine concerns about illiberal elements of Islam. When we're in a state where it is seen as somehow prejudiced to say that a culture which allows same-sex couples to get married is better than one that throws them off high buildings, then we have become so morally relativistic that we are not having we're not having reasonable conversations anymore. We have to feel confident to say some ideologies are very, very illiberal. We have holders of very illiberal ideologies here. We need to address the problem of that, and we can do that without while sort of amplifying and supporting the liberal voices from within in those communities. So I think too often people feel as though they must be anti-Muslim or they have to be pro-Muslim, when in fact you can be anti the illiberalism, which is unfortunately rather elevated in adherence to Islam, without assuming this about every individual, and without while supporting those who are already addressing it from a Muslim perspective.
All right, Helen, that was a very strange. Oh, hang on. Daniel's back. Final question.
Well, no, it wasn't the question. I was going to say that Islamophobia, I think, is even more problematic than Helen and Patrick allow, because I think it's right to say it lumps together anti-Muslim bigotry, which is appalling, with criticism of Islam, and people should be able to criticize any faith, including Islam. But there is an additional element, which is Islamism, which I would see as a political movement kind of wrapped in the form of the Islamic religion. So it would include movements like Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, Jamaat-e-Islami, and those movements very cynically use the label of Islamophobia to shut down any criticism of them as well. So I think people recognize it's problematic, but I think often don't see quite how problematic it is as a concept.
Oh, I certainly agree and do see it as that problematic. I do think this is something we have to untangle very, very urgently. Otherwise, tensions are going to rise. We need to be able to have these conversations. We need to be able to say, I have these concerns about cultural clashes with illiberal elements of certain cultures without being assumed to be racist or xenophobic. And as you say, it's that Islamism is a particularly concentrated form of political Islam, and that cannot be justified as any kind of bigotry to criticize it.
Very good. Okay, look, we'll have to stop there. I think that was my question on Muslimness rather than Muslims. But there you go. Look, I think it was really interesting what you had to say. For me, it's one of those. I was thinking when Trump was speaking the other day. Remember when Ngozi Fulani, that black woman, was asked the question, "Where are you from?" in the Royal Garden Party, and she said it was a horrendous abuse, terrible harm that was caused to her. And then I was reminded when Trump dared to criticize the Afghan journalist. I don't know if anybody saw it on TV, when he said, "Where are you from?" and then said, "The funny thing is I don't understand a single word you're saying." And I was wondering whether that was a move forward where we were allowed to say that, or whether actually just reference the fact that Trump has got no kind of filters, whether racial insults are now acceptable, or whether we're allowed to speak more freely. So it's kind of, as you say, it's a delicate balance that we have to have here. And I suppose while it results in kind of abuse in some respects, free speech is better than the alternatives. I think that's where we can hopefully agree in this conversation. Look, Helen, that was terrific. You haven't got to come back on me. It's all right. That was my little grandiose grandstanding at the end. But thank you very much for that. Let me just say, ladies and gentlemen, you really need to get a copy of this book, the Counterweight Handbook. It's a fabulous piece of work, great research, great examples, and something for everyone. But I think most of all, you can take away some of the arguments and shove it in the face of those people who are giving you a hard time in the office. So for that, it's, all credit to you, Helen. Thank you very much indeed for a real social service. So now we would.
Great to talk to you.
The pleasure has been mine. So thank you, everyone. Quick round of applause, please, for Helen, if you would. Unmute. Thank you all very much indeed.